A man stood on stage in ancient Athens and called the most powerful politician in the city a lying, corrupt thief to his face in front of thousands, and the crowd roared with laughter. This wasn't some reckless fool about to be executed. This was Aristophanes, and he was just getting started. Around 446 BCE, while Athens was building the Parthenon and reshaping the Mediterranean world, a boy was born into a family comfortable enough to own property on Aegina. His father, Philippus, had money, connections, education, the kind of background that gave you options in ancient Greece. Young Aristophanes could have become a merchant, a politician, a philosopher. Instead, he chose something far more dangerous. He decided to make people laugh while telling them truths they didn't want to hear. We know almost nothing about his childhood. No diaries survived, no letters, no biographical details beyond fragments scattered through his own plays and later commentaries written by people who were guessing as much as we are now. But we know the world he grew up in. Athens, in the mid-5th century BCE, was experiencing a golden age that would never be repeated. The city had defeated the Persian Empire twice. Democracy was flourishing in ways that seemed impossible to the rest of the Greek world. Art, architecture, philosophy, drama were all reaching heights that would influence Western civilization for millennia. Walk through Athens during Aristophanes' youth, and you'd pass Socrates arguing in the Agora, challenging every assumption anyone held about virtue and knowledge. You might see Sophocles' latest tragedy being prepared for the festival, or hear about Euripides' controversial new play that everyone was debating. Pericles was transforming the city with ambitious building projects funded by tribute from Athens' empire. The Parthenon gleamed white marble on the Acropolis, a statement in stone that Athens had arrived. But there was darkness underneath the brilliance. The democracy Pericles praised in his famous funeral oration was built on the backs of slaves. Women had essentially no political rights. The Athenian Empire maintained its power through intimidation and occasional brutality toward allied cities who wanted independence. And in 431 BCE, when Aristophanes was about 15, Athens went to war with Sparta. The Peloponnesian War would last 27 years, consume enormous resources, and ultimately destroy Athens' power. It would also provide Aristophanes with endless material. His education was traditional for a wealthy family: music, gymnastics, rhetoric, poetry. He learned Homer by heart, the foundation of all Greek education. He studied the great tragic playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles, whose works were performed at the annual festivals. He learned to speak persuasively, to argue both sides of a question, to recognize logical fallacies and rhetorical tricks. This wasn't abstract academic training. In democratic Athens, your ability to speak in the assembly or defend yourself in court could determine your entire future. Every educated man needed these skills. What set Aristophanes apart was what he did with that education. Most well-off young men went into politics or business. He went into comedy. At 19 years old, impossibly young for serious artistic competition, he started writing plays. His first known work was The Banqueters in 427 BCE, which dealt with the conflict between old-fashioned education and the new sophistic learning that was scandalizing traditionalists. The play is lost now, survived only in fragments and references, but it apparently made enough of an impression to launch his career. Then came The Babylonians in 426 BCE. This play attacked Cleon, the most powerful demagogue in Athens, so savagely that Cleon actually prosecuted the young playwright for slandering the city in front of foreigners at the city Dionysia festival. Imagine being 20 years old and having the most dangerous politician in Athens angry enough to take you to court. Most people would have apologized, backed down, played it safe. Aristophanes did the opposite. He kept attacking Cleon again and again in play after play for years. The prosecution failed. We don't know exactly why. Maybe the charges were too vague. Maybe Athenian juries really did protect freedom of speech as fiercely as they claimed. Maybe Cleon's own unpopularity with certain segments of society worked in Aristophanes' favour. Whatever the reason, the young playwright emerged from the experience emboldened rather than intimidated. He'd learned something crucial. You could say almost anything in Athens if you were funny enough. This was the peculiar genius of Athenian democracy. Yes, it was flawed, limited, hypocritical in countless ways, but it did allow a level of public criticism that would have been unthinkable in most ancient societies. In Persia, insulting the king meant death. In Sparta, the state controlled everything, including what you could say. In Athens, you could stand in the theatre of Dionysus and mock the leading politicians, the military strategy, the gods themselves, and the audience would applaud if you did it well enough. The first of Aristophanes' plays to survive complete is the Acharnians, produced in 425 BCE, when he was about 21. It won first prize at the Lennia festival, and it shows exactly what made him revolutionary. The Peloponnesian War had been raging for 6 years. Patriotic fervour was intense. Young men were dying. Farms were being burned. The whole society was mobilized for conflict. And Aristophanes wrote a comedy about a man who makes his own private peace treaty with Sparta and enjoys wine, food and sex while everyone else suffers. The protagonist Dicaeopolis wants peace. The chorus of Acharnians, elderly charcoal burners whose livelihood has been destroyed by Spartan raids, wants to stone him to death for even suggesting it. Dicaeopolis has to defend himself using rhetorical tricks borrowed from Euripides, including literally dressing in rags to gain sympathy. It's political commentary, literary parody, and obscene humour all woven together. The play doesn't just criticise the war, it suggests that ordinary people's desire for peace matters more than elite political calculations about honour and power. This established the template Aristophanes would follow for decades. Take a current political or social issue, create an absurd, fantastical solution to it, show the consequences of that solution through increasingly ridiculous scenarios. Pack it all with jokes ranging from sophisticated wordplay to dick jokes. Make the audience laugh so hard they almost miss how radical the underlying message is. Almost. In 424 BCE came the Knights, his most vicious attack on Cleon. The politician is portrayed as a Paphlagonian slave who's gained control over his master Deimos, representing the Athenian people, through shameless flattery. A sausage seller, even more vulgar and shameless, defeats him by out-demagoguing the demagogue. Aristophanes reportedly had trouble finding an actor willing to play Cleon and a mask maker willing to create his mask. So he played the role himself, face smeared with wine lees. The play won first prize. Think about what this means. The most powerful politician in Athens has been publicly humiliated in front of thousands of citizens, portrayed as a corrupt manipulator who treats the people like idiots. And the people loved it. They gave the play first prize. Cleon remained powerful, sure, but he'd been diminished, mocked, made into a figure of fun. That's a kind of power too. Then in 423 BCE, Aristophanes made a miscalculation. The clouds targeted the new intellectual movement in Athens, with Socrates as the main representative. In the play, an old farmer enrolls in Socrates' thinkery to learn how to argue away his debts. Socrates teaches atheistic natural philosophy, worships clouds instead of gods, and makes the weaker argument defeat the stronger. The farmer's son learns these tricks and uses them to justify beating his own father. It's clever, funny, packed with parodies of intellectual pretension. It finished third in the competition. The failure stung. Aristophanes apparently revised the play later, and the version we have may reflect that revision. But the real problem with the clouds only became clear decades later, when Socrates was put on trial and executed in 399 BCE. Plato's Apology has Socrates himself reference the prejudices created by comic poets who portrayed him as an atheist and corrupter of youth. Did Aristophanes contribute to the climate that killed Socrates? Almost certainly. Did he intend that outcome? Almost certainly not. He was doing what comic poets did, exaggerating real concerns about new education into absurd scenarios. But words have consequences beyond their author's intentions. This tension runs through Aristophanes' entire career. He was both conservative and radical, defending traditional values while using innovative theatrical techniques, criticizing democracy while depending on democratic freedom of speech, mocking intellectuals while displaying enormous intellectual sophistication himself. He attacked war profiteers while Athens was at war, criticized imperial exploitation while living off the wealth that empire generated, championed the common man while clearly being educated elite himself. The wasps, in 422 BCE, went after a different target, the Athenian addiction to jury service. The protagonist Philocleon is obsessed with serving on juries where he can exercise power over wealthy defendants and collect his small daily pay. His son tries to cure him by staging a mock trial at home. The chorus is elderly jurors dressed as wasps, irascible and ready to sting. The play is simultaneously sympathetic to these old men who genuinely believe they're serving their city, and critical of the politicians who manipulate them into thinking they have real power. This is where Aristophanes gets complicated. He's not simply pro-elite or pro-common people. He sees both sides being manipulated by demagogues who benefit from division and conflict. His politics don't fit modern categories. He defends traditional aristocratic values while attacking actual aristocrats when they're hypocrites. He supports the common citizen while mocking democratic institutions. He wants peace but ridicules peace treaties when they're badly negotiated. In 421 BCE, actual peace negotiations between Athens and Sparta led to the Peace of Nicias. Aristophanes produced peace right as this was happening. The protagonist flies to heaven on a giant dung beetle to rescue the goddess, peace from imprisonment. The imagery is earthy and scatological. The beetle needs enormous amounts of excrement for fuel. Peace herself appears with attendants named Harvest Festival and Showtime, representing the agricultural and theatrical celebrations that war has prevented. The play ends with a wedding, symbolizing the fertility and regeneration peace brings. The actual Peace of Nicias would prove unsatisfactory and short-lived. But Aristophanes' play captures genuine war weariness after a decade of conflict. People were exhausted. Farms had been burned repeatedly. Young men had died in battles that accomplished nothing lasting. The play speaks to that exhaustion while maintaining enough distance through fantasy and absurdity to avoid seeming defeatist or unpatriotic. By the early 410s BCE, Aristophanes was the most successful comic playwright in Athens, winning prizes regularly, drawing huge audiences, setting the standard others tried to match. He was probably in his mid-30s, established enough to take bigger risks, confident enough to attempt his most ambitious work yet. In 414 BCE, he produced The Birds. And here's where things get really interesting. Because The Birds is unlike anything else in ancient comedy. Two Athenians, tired of lawsuits and bustle, convince birds to build a city in the sky called Cloud Cuckoo Land. This new city intercepts sacrifices rising from earth to heaven, allowing the birds to blackmail the gods into surrendering power. It's pure fantasy, but it's also potentially commentary on Athenian imperialism and the disastrous Sicilian expedition that was being prepared even as the play was staged. The Sicilian expedition was Athens' most ambitious and ultimately disastrous military adventure. In 415 BCE, just as Aristophanes was staging The Birds, Athens sent a massive fleet to conquer Syracuse in Sicily. The justification was helping an ally, but the real goal was imperial expansion. The expedition would end in complete catastrophe 2 years later, with the entire Athenian force destroyed or enslaved, thousands of citizens dead. The treasury emptied, the beginning of Athens' final decline. Was the birds? Commentary on this? Scholars have argued about it for centuries. The timing is suspicious. Here's a play about two Athenians who decide to escape their city and build a new empire in the clouds, who become increasingly tyrannical as they gain power, who overreach spectacularly in their ambitions. The parallels to Athens' imperial ambitions are hard to miss, but Aristophanes never makes it explicit. That's the genius and the frustration of his work. He gives you enough to see the connections but never confirms them directly. Was Pisistratus, the protagonist who transforms from refugee to cosmic tyrant, meant to represent Athens? Or was it just a fantastical comedy that happened to resonate with current events? We'll never know for certain. The play works either way. What we do know is that the birds represents Aristophanes at his creative peak. The bird chorus required elaborate costumes with wings and beaks. The choral odes contain some of his most beautiful lyric poetry, celebrating the freedom and joy of flight. The plot moves from simple escape fantasy to cosmic revolution with perfect pacing. A parade of unwanted Athenian types shows up trying to exploit the new city. A poet looking for patronage, an oracle monger peddling prophecies, a decree seller wanting to impose regulations. Pisistratus drives them all away, with increasing violence. The play celebrates the dream of starting fresh, building something new away from the corruption and complications of existing society. But it also shows that dream corrupting, Pisistratus becomes what he fled. He establishes his own tyranny, his own exploitation, his own imperial ambitions. By the end, he's married sovereignty herself and rules the cosmos. The escape fantasy has become a conquest fantasy. Human nature hasn't changed. It's just found new territory to dominate. 3 years later, in 411 BCE, Athens was in crisis. The Sicilian disaster had happened. The treasury was empty. Sparta had built a permanent fort in Attica, making agriculture impossible. The democracy itself was under threat from oligarchic conspirators who would briefly seize power that summer. This was the darkest moment of the war, and Aristophanes produced Lysistrata. The premise is absurd. The women of Greece, led by the Athenian Lysistrata, organize a sex strike to force their husbands to make peace. Simultaneously, older women seize the Acropolis and the treasury to prevent further war funding. The men suffer comically from sexual deprivation, walking around with enormous erections that the costume fallacies made visually obvious. The women struggle to maintain their strike, inventing ridiculous excuses to sneak away and sleep with their husbands. Eventually, the men give in. Spartans and Athenians negotiate peace while ogling the naked personification of reconciliation. They dividing up Greek territories like they're dividing up a woman's body. The play ends with Spartans and Athenians feasting and dancing together in harmony. It's bawdy, crude, and shocking in its premise. Giving women political agency and sexual power was transgressive even in fantasy. Real Athenian women had no political rights, couldn't own property independently, were expected to be silent and invisible in public life. Yet here's Lysistrata, presented as more intelligent, rational, and capable than any of the male politicians. She organises an international coalition. She maintains discipline among her followers. She negotiates the final peace settlement, while the men can barely think straight. The sexual humour doesn't obscure the serious anti-war message. War is irrational. It's sustained by masculine ego and prosecuted by those who don't actually fight. The women point out that they're the ones who suffer when men die in battles, when farms are burned, when the economy collapses. They have the most to lose and no voice in the decisions. The sex strike is their only weapon, using men's desires against them to force rational behaviour. But there's something darker underneath. The women can only exercise power through sexuality, through withholding what men want. They can't simply take power directly. And the resolution involves them being sexually objectified even as they're supposedly winning. The naked figure of reconciliation, that the men divide up while negotiating peace, makes this explicit. Women's bodies remain the currency of male politics even in this fantasy of female empowerment. The same year, 411 BCE, Aristophanes produced another play with a completely different focus. Thesmophoria Zeusai takes aim at Euripides, the tragic playwright. The women of Athens, celebrating a religious festival, plan to put Euripides on trial for slandering women in his tragedies. His elderly relative Mnesilicus disguises himself as a woman to defend him, but makes things worse by arguing that women are actually far more wicked than Euripides portrayed. When the disguise is discovered, Euripides attempts various rescue schemes, each parodying one of his own plays. He tries the escape from Helen, then the recognition scene from Andromeda. Each parody is sophisticated and detailed, requiring the audience to know the originals well enough to appreciate the comic distortions, tragic conventions applied to ridiculous situations, solemn language describing absurd predicaments. Eventually, Euripides negotiates directly with the women and gains Mnesilicus's release, through compromise rather than theatrical trickery. This is pure literary comedy, less concerned with politics than with the nature of tragedy itself. It shows Aristophanes' deep engagement with the other major dramatic form of his time. His parodies aren't just mockery, they demonstrate genuine knowledge and appreciation. He knew these plays intimately, understood their techniques, could reproduce their effects for comic purposes. The relationship between old comedy and tragedy was symbiotic. They fed off each other, referenced each other, competed for the same audiences at the same festivals. 6 years later, in 405 BCE, both Sophocles and Euripides had died. These were the two greatest tragic playwrights of the age, and they died within months of each other. Athens was about to lose the war completely. The city was under siege, starving, facing imminent defeat. Into this crisis, Aristophanes brought frogs. The god Dionysus travels to Hades to bring back a great tragedian because the quality of contemporary tragedy has declined so severely. After crossing the river of the dead, accompanied by the famous frog chorus singing Brekakekex Coax Coax, he finds Euripides challenging Aeschylus for the throne of tragedy in the underworld. The centerpiece is an extended literary debate between them about what tragedy should be. Aeschylus represents the old style, grand, patriotic, morally uplifting. He wrote plays that made citizens into better people, that inspired martial courage, that upheld traditional values. Euripides represents the new approach, realistic, psychological, questioning. He put ordinary people on stage speaking ordinary language. He explored moral ambiguity. He made audiences think rather than simply feel. They compare techniques. Aeschylus mocks Euripides' prologues as formulaic. Euripides criticizes Aeschylus's bombastic language. They weigh their verses on literal scales, with Aeschylus's weightier lines defeating Euripides' cleverness. The debate is hilarious and sophisticated simultaneously, full of specific literary references that require detailed knowledge of both playwrights' works. Ultimately, Dionysus chooses Aeschylus, not because his poetry is objectively better, but because he can offer advice to save Athens. The city needs the old values now, the traditional moral certainty, the patriotic inspiration. Euripides' questioning and ambiguity won't help in this crisis. Athens needs to believe in something, even if that belief is rooted in the past. The Parabasis contains direct political advice. The play won first prize and received the extraordinary honour of a second performance, granted because its political counsel was considered valuable. This was theatre functioning as civic discourse, the comic playwright offering actual policy recommendations in the middle of a catastrophic war. The conservative literary preferences are clear. Aristophanes consistently favoured the older style in everything. Old education over new sophistry. Traditional values over modern questioning. Rural simplicity over urban sophistication. Aeschylus over Euripides. But his conservatism was sophisticated. He understood what he was rejecting. His parodies of Euripides demonstrate deep engagement with the newer style, even while preferring the older one. After Athens lost the war in 404 BCE, the city changed fundamentally. The empire was gone. The walls were torn down. The democracy was briefly replaced by an oligarchy of 30 tyrants who ruled through terror. When democracy was restored, it was weakened, cautious, aware of its fragility. The cosmic political battles of the previous generation no longer made sense. Cleon was long dead. The war was over. The questions had changed. Aristophanes' later plays reflect this transformation. Ecclesia Zeusai, produced around 392 BCE, shows women taking over the government and implementing a radical communist program. Private property abolished. Common ownership of goods and people. Sexual access democratized, so the young must satisfy the old and ugly before enjoying each other. Its utopian political philosophy taken to absurd extremes, possibly engaging with ideas circulating about Plato's Republic. The scheme leads to comic complications. 3 increasingly grotesque old women claim simultaneous rights to a young man under the new sexual equality laws. The humour is darker, more cynical about political solutions. The style is shifting toward what scholars call middle comedy, less topical satire, more focus on social themes and domestic situations. The chorus has diminished importance. The parabasis is gone. The structure is looser. Plutus, probably revised around 388 BCE, pushes further in this direction. The god of wealth is blind, distributing money randomly. When his sight is restored, wealth flows to the deserving and away from the wicked. This creates social transformation, but also complications. An old woman loses her young lover who no longer needs her money. The gods suffer because people stop sacrificing. The just man celebrates, but the sycophant complains. It's more philosophical than political, less about specific Athenian situations and more about universal questions of justice and prosperity. The chorus barely participates, perhaps just singing interludes between scenes. This might reflect practical considerations since chorus training was expensive, or it might show evolving theatrical tastes. Either way, it marks a significant evolution from the elaborate choral odes of the earlier plays. These later works show Aristophanes adapting to a changed world. The political landscape that produced the savage attacks on Cleon and the desperate anti-war pleas no longer existed. Athens was diminished, no longer the imperial power dominating Greece. The questions were smaller, more domestic, more concerned with how to live in reduced circumstances than how to rule an empire. Yet Aristophanes never disappeared entirely from the theatrical scene. His influence persisted through his sons, who carried on the family profession. Araros and Philippus both wrote comedies, though their works haven't survived. Some scholars think certain late plays attributed to Aristophanes might actually be collaborations or even works by his sons performed under his name. The practice wasn't unusual. Reputation mattered enormously in getting plays selected for performance, and an established name opened doors. The fragments of lost plays tantalize us with glimpses of what's missing. 40 plays across a career spanning 4 decades, and we have 11. The mathematics is brutal. 29 plays exist only as scattered quotations. In later authors, brief mentions in ancient commentaries, or plot summaries that raise more questions than they answer. The Babylonians from 426 BCEE apparently depicted Athenian allies as slaves grinding at a mill, a savage critique of imperial policy that enraged Cleon enough to prosecute Aristophanes for slandering the city before foreigners. The play is gone, but its impact echoed through the playwright's career. That early controversy established his reputation for fearlessness and made him enemies who would never forget. The farmers probably contrasted rural virtue with urban corruption, a theme that appears repeatedly in the surviving plays. The merchant ships dealt with commercial matters at a time when Athens' naval empire was reaching its peak. Amphiaraus seems to have satirized oracle mongers and religious fraudsters, showing Aristophanes wasn't just attacking politicians and intellectuals, but the entire apparatus of superstition that thrived in wartime Athens. The late plays Cocalus and Aeolosicon apparently dealt with mythological subjects in ways that anticipated New Comedy's focus on domestic situations and love stories. These fragments suggest Aristophanes was evolving stylistically, moving away from the savage political satire of his youth toward the more universal themes that would characterize Greek comedy in the following century. What we've lost isn't just individual plays. We've lost the full arc of a career, the complete picture of how Aristophanic comedy developed over 40 years. The 11 survivors come from different periods, but they're scattered data points, not a continuous record. Entire phases of his work exist only as shadows. And it's not just Aristophanes, we've lost almost everything from old comedy. Other playwrights competed against him at the festivals. Cratinus was considered his equal or superior by some contemporaries. Eupolis was brilliant, according to ancient critics. Pherecrates, Plauto Comicus, Hermippus, dozens of others whose names survive, but whose works are mostly gone. This creates a distortion. We see Aristophanes as unique because he's what survived, but old comedy was a thriving genre with multiple talented practitioners. Aristophanes may have been the best, but he was working within a tradition, responding to rivals, building on innovations others had made. The competitive environment shaped his work in ways we can barely reconstruct. The selection process that preserved these 11 plays while letting 29 disappear tells its own story. In the Hellenistic period, centuries after Aristophanes died, scholars in Alexandria began creating educational canons. They chose texts for schools, deciding which works deserved preservation and copying. Those choices determined what survived the transition from papyrus scrolls to parchment codices, from classical Greece through Roman Empire into medieval manuscript culture. The plays they selected were probably the most accessible, the least dependent on specific topical knowledge. The Cloud survived partly because it dealt with Socrates, a universally famous figure. Frog survived because of its literary criticism, which remained relevant even when the specific political context had faded. Lysistrata survived because its anti-war theme and sexual humour had broad appeal. The plays that didn't make the cut were probably more narrowly focused on 5th century Athenian politics, harder to understand without extensive commentary, less useful for teaching Greek language and rhetoric. They were casualties of changing educational priorities and the simple economics of manuscript production. Copying was expensive. Only texts with guaranteed audiences justified the cost. This process repeated across centuries. Each transition, each copying, each curatorial decision winnowed the collection further. By late antiquity, the 11 plays we have were standard school texts. Everything else became increasingly rare, existing in fewer copies until the final manuscripts crumbled and the works vanished forever. But those 11 plays created a literary legacy that extended far beyond Greece. When Rome conquered the Greek world, they absorbed Greek culture wholesale, and comedy was part of the package. Roman playwrights like Plautus and Terence adapted Greek New Comedy for Latin audiences. Old Comedy was harder to adapt because its topical political satire didn't translate, but its influence persisted in Roman satire's aggressive mockery of contemporary figures. The Byzantine Empire maintained Greek literary traditions, and Aristophanes remained part of the educational curriculum. Medieval Greek scholars wrote commentaries explaining references that had become obscure. These scholia, preserved in manuscript margins, are often our only source for understanding topical jokes about long-dead politicians and forgotten scandals. When Greek manuscripts began flowing into Western Europe during the Renaissance, Aristophanes came with them. Humanist scholars rediscovered the plays, though they struggled with the obscenity and political content. How could such crude material be classical literature worthy of study? The tension between admiring ancient Greece and being scandalized by actual Greek culture created fascinating contortions. Early translators sometimes bowdlerized the sexual content or added apologetic prefaces explaining that ancient morals were different. Others celebrated Aristophanes precisely for his freedom, seeing him as exemplifying the liberty of ancient republics before Christian moralism imposed restrictions. The plays became evidence in political arguments about democracy, freedom of speech, and the relationship between art and power. The French Revolution found inspiration in Aristophanes' attacks on demagogues and tyrants. 19th century liberals admired his championing of the common citizen. 20th century scholars used him to understand ancient democracy, theatrical practice, and social history. Each generation discovered different aspects worth preserving. Modern productions face fascinating challenges. The topical jokes require extensive program notes. References to contemporary politicians mean nothing to audiences 24 centuries removed. The bawdy humour can still shock, though modern sensibilities have different boundaries than Victorian ones. Directors must decide how much to update, how much to preserve, how to make ancient comedy work for contemporary viewers. Lysistrata has been particularly popular, adapted for various wars and political situations. Its anti-war message and battle of the sexes comedy translate across cultures. Productions have updated it to World War I, Vietnam, Iraq, maintaining the basic plot while changing specific references. The adaptability proves something fundamental in the play transcends its original context. But adaptation raises questions about authenticity. When you update Aristophanes, stripping away the specific 5th century references and replacing them with contemporary equivalents, is it still Aristophanes? The structure remains, the basic plot, the character types, but the texture of the original, its linguistic density and cultural specificity, disappears in translation. Reading Aristophanes in ancient Greek reveals wordplay impossible to render in English, puns depending on the sounds of Greek words, double meanings exploiting grammatical ambiguities, rhythmic effects created by specific metrical patterns. Translation always involves loss, but with Aristophanes the losses are particularly severe because so much of his comedy operates at the level of language itself. Even in Greek, modern readers need extensive help. The scholia explain who Cleon was, what the Peloponnesian War involved, why certain references were funny. Without this apparatus, much of the humour dies. A joke that needs explanation isn't funny anymore. The plays survive as literary texts studied by scholars, but their original function as entertainment for mass audiences has been transformed into something quite different. Yet certain elements remain immediately accessible. Physical comedy transcends language barriers. A character trying to escape by dressing as a woman and being discovered creates humour through situation regardless of the specific words used. The visual gag of enormous fallacies on male characters works without translation. Slapstick survives when verbal wit doesn't. The fundamental situations Aristophanes dramatizes also retain power. War weariness, political corruption, generational conflict, the tension between idealism and practical reality. These remain recognizable human experiences. When Dicaeopolis makes a private peace treaty because he's exhausted by war, when Lysistrata organizes women to force men into sanity, when Strepsiades seeks education to escape debt, these motivations make sense across millennia. What makes Aristophanes perpetually relevant isn't the specific political positions he advocated, but his method. He used comedy to question authority, to puncture pretension, to make audiences think about alternatives to the status quo. The specific targets change, but the approach remains applicable. Every society has its demagogues, its intellectual frauds, its unjust wars, its corrupt institutions worth mocking. The freedom he exercised remains remarkable. Imagine a contemporary playwright staging a comedy at a national theatre that personally attacks the president or prime minister by name, portraying them as corrupt and stupid while the country is at war. That's what Aristophanes did repeatedly. The fact that Athens allowed this, even celebrated it by awarding prizes, reveals something fundamental about democratic culture at its most robust. Of course, that freedom had limits. Aristophanes was a citizen, a member of the privileged class. His mockery targeted other citizens, not the institution of citizenship itself. Women, slaves, foreigners existed in his plays largely as objects of humour rather than subjects with their own voices. The freedom of speech he exercised was constrained by unexamined assumptions about who deserved a voice. Modern readers rightly note these limitations. Aristophanes' women are often presented as sexually voracious, deceptive, or irrational. His slaves speak in comic accents. His foreigners are stereotypes. The plays reflect the prejudices of 5th century Athens, even while criticising its politics. Progressive in some ways, deeply conservative in others, they resist simple categorization. The scholarly apparatus surrounding Aristophanes creates its own kind of barrier. Academic editions bristle with footnotes explaining historical context, identifying obscure references, glossing difficult vocabulary. This scholarly mediation is necessary, but transforms the reading experience. Instead of encountering the plays directly, modern readers navigate through layers of explanation and interpretation. The joke becomes an object of study rather than an immediate provocation to laughter. Think about how this works in practice. You're reading along, encounter a line, stop to check the footnote, learn about some politician from 424 BCE, return to the text, try to recapture the rhythm. The flow breaks, the immediacy dies. What was meant to be experienced in real time, performed before thousands in an outdoor theatre, becomes a puzzle to be solved through scholarship. Yet without that scholarship, the plays would be nearly incomprehensible. The choice isn't between pure experience and mediated understanding. It's between understanding with help or understanding almost nothing at all. The historical distance is simply too great to bridge through intuition alone. Performance offers a different kind of access. When actors embody the characters, when the language becomes speech rather than text, something changes. The plays were written for performance, and performance can reveal dimensions that reading obscures. Physical comedy doesn't need footnotes. Timing, gesture, tone of voice carry meaning that survives translation and historical distance. Modern productions of Aristophanes face fascinating challenges. How do you stage a flying dung beetle? What do you do with the enormous fallacies that male characters wore? How explicit should the sexual content be? Different productions answer these questions differently, creating vastly different experiences from the same text. Some directors emphasize the political satire, updating references to make them relevant to contemporary audiences. A production might transform Cleon into a recognizable modern politician. The Peloponnesian War into a current conflict. This makes the plays immediately accessible, but risks losing the specific historical texture that made them what they were. Other directors lean into the strangeness, presenting the plays as artifacts from an alien culture. The costumes are aggressively unrealistic, the sexuality deliberately shocking, the political references explained through program notes. This approach preserves historical distance, but can make the plays feel like museum pieces rather than living theatre. The tension between these approaches reflects a fundamental problem. Aristophanes was writing for a specific audience at a specific moment. His plays intervened in ongoing debates, referenced current events, assumed shared cultural knowledge. That specificity was their power, but it's also what makes them difficult to revive. Consider The Knights, with its savage mockery of Cleon. The play's entire structure depends on the audience knowing who Cleon was, understanding his political methods, recognizing the specific ways Aristophanes distorts and exaggerates his characteristics. For ancient Athenians watching in 424 BCE, these references were immediate and charged. For modern audiences, Cleon is just a name requiring explanation. You could replace Cleon with a contemporary politician, but something essential would be lost. The play isn't just about generic political corruption. It's about Cleon specifically, about the particular dynamics of Athenian democracy in the 420s, about debates whose stakes we can reconstruct through scholarship, but never fully recapture. The chorus presents another challenge. Aristophanic comedy relied heavily on elaborate choral performances with complex choreography and music. We have the words they sang, but the melodies are lost. The dance movements can only be inferred. A crucial element of the original performance survives only as text, stripped of its musical and kinetic dimensions. Modern productions must create new choreography and music, essentially reinventing half the performance. Some directors commission original scores, attempting to recreate what ancient Greek music might have sounded like. Others use contemporary musical styles, turning choral odes into rock songs or rap. Each choice creates a different play. The parabasis creates particular difficulties. This is the section where the chorus addresses the audience directly, often speaking for the playwright about contemporary issues. In ancient Athens, this broke the theatrical illusion to deliver direct political commentary. The effect was presumably striking, a sudden shift from dramatic action to personal address. But what does the parabasis mean for modern audiences? The topical references are obscure. The personal grievances Aristophanes aired about his rivals and critics mean nothing to people unfamiliar with 5th century theatrical politics. Directors sometimes cut the parabasis entirely, or radically adapt it, or preserve it as a curiosity while acknowledging it won't fully work. These performance challenges aren't just technical problems. They reveal something fundamental about what happens when art travels across time. Aristophanes created works perfectly calibrated for their original context. That calibration is what made them successful, but it's also what makes them difficult to revive. The bawdiness presents its own issues. Ancient Greek comedy was sexually explicit in ways that can shock modern audiences. The humour about erections, sexual acts, and bodily functions wasn't subtle. It was direct, graphic, and apparently hilarious to 5th century Athenians. Modern productions must decide how to handle this material. Some embrace it fully, staging the sexual content as explicitly as possible. Others soften it, suggesting rather than showing. Still others cut it, deciding the sexual humour is too dated or offensive to preserve. But cutting the bawdiness fundamentally changes the plays. The sexual content isn't just adolescent humour, it's often integral to the political satire. In Lysistrata, the sex strike works as political strategy precisely because of how graphically the plays depicts male frustration. Soften that element, and you soften the political point. The gender dynamics create additional complications. Aristophanes' female characters are complex. On one hand, figures like Lysistrata and Praxagora are intelligent, capable, more rational than their male counterparts. They see through political nonsense and take decisive action to solve problems men have created. On the other hand, the plays were written by a man, performed by men, for a largely male audience in a society where women had no political rights. The feminist moments exist within a framework of assumptions about gender that modern audiences find problematic. The plays simultaneously empower women as characters while treating actual women as objects of humour. Modern feminist scholars and directors have engaged productively with this tension. Some read the plays as genuinely challenging gender hierarchies, arguing that Aristophanes was more progressive than his society. Others see the female empowerment as fantasy that ultimately reinforces male control. Both readings find support in the texts. The question of how to perform these plays now becomes political. Do you stage them as period pieces reflecting ancient attitudes? Do you adapt them to make them more palatable to contemporary sensibilities? Do you embrace the problematic elements as opportunities for critical engagement? Different productions answer differently, and the debates continue. Aristophanes remains controversial in ways that reflect ongoing arguments about art, politics, and representation. The fact that these arguments happen at all demonstrates the play's continuing vitality. What makes certain works survive while others disappear? Why do we still read and perform Aristophanes when almost all his contemporaries are lost? The answer isn't simply quality, though quality matters. It's also accident, institutional preservation, and the specific ways certain works prove useful to later generations. Aristophanes survived because his plays were selected for the educational canon in Hellenistic and Roman times. Teachers chose 11 of his approximately 40 plays as exemplary texts for students. Those 11 were copied repeatedly, the others weren't, and gradually disappeared as manuscripts decayed. The selection criteria reflected the values of later educators, not necessarily the judgment of Aristophanes' contemporaries. Plays that won prizes in competition that ancient audiences loved might have been excluded from the canon for being too difficult, too obscene, or too topical. The 11 that survived did so partly because they worked as teaching texts. This means we're seeing Aristophanes through a particular filter. The most challenging, most experimental, most politically dangerous works may be among the lost plays. What survives represents Aristophanes as later generations wanted to remember him, not necessarily Aristophanes as he was. The fragments of lost plays tantalize with possibilities. Brief quotations preserved in ancient commentaries hint at plays dealing with topics we'd love to know more about. But fragments can't reconstruct whole works. We have pieces without context, jokes without setup, references without explanation. Scholars have attempted to reconstruct lost plays from fragments, ancient plot summaries, and references in other texts. These reconstructions are educated guesses at best, scholarly exercises that remind us how much has been lost. The Aristophanes we know is a partial Aristophanes, preserved by chance and institutional selection. Yet what survives is substantial. 11 complete plays represent a significant body of work, more than we have from any other Greek comic playwright. We can trace the development of his style across decades, see how his political views evolved, watch him experiment with different approaches to comedy. The range is remarkable, from the savage political satire of The Knights to the fantastic escapism of The Birds, from the literary parody of Thesmophoria Zeusai to the philosophical comedy of Plutus. Aristophanes worked in multiple registers. Each play feels distinct, while remaining recognizably his work. His influence on subsequent comedy is difficult to trace precisely because so much ancient theatre is lost. We know Roman playwrights like Plautus and Terence adapted Greek New Comedy, But new comedy was different from Aristophanes' old comedy. The political satire and choral performances had disappeared, replaced by domestic comedies, focusing on romance and family relationships. Whether Aristophanes directly influenced this evolution or simply represents an earlier stage in comedy's development remains debated. His plays were studied and admired, but the form he practiced didn't continue unchanged. Comedy evolved, and Aristophanes became a monument to what had been rather than a model for what could be. Renaissance and early modern European playwrights knew Aristophanes through Latin translations and scholarly commentaries. Some attempted to write in Aristophanic style, but the cultural context was so different that the results rarely succeeded. The combination of political satire, religious festivals, and Athenian democratic culture couldn't be simply transplanted. Yet certain Aristophanic elements persisted in European comedy. The use of fantastic premises, the mixing of high and low humour, the willingness to mock authority, all these reappear in various forms. Whether direct influence or parallel development, comedy continued to do some of what Aristophanes had done. Modern political satire owes something to his example, even when the creators don't know they're following it. The use of comedy to criticize power, to question official narratives, to give voice to frustration with war or corruption, these are Aristophanic strategies that resurface across cultures and centuries. Television shows that mock politicians, satirical websites that create fake news to reveal truth, comedians who use humor to make serious points about society, all participate in a tradition Aristophanes helped establish. The specific forms change, but the fundamental approach, using laughter as a weapon against pretension and power, remains recognizable. What Aristophanes demonstrated was that comedy could be serious without ceasing to be funny. His plays make arguments about war, democracy, education, and justice, while also featuring characters riding giant dung beetles and wearing enormous fallacies. The combination seems impossible, but works because both elements are genuine. He took his politics seriously and his comedy seriously, refusing to subordinate either to the other. The result was art that engaged its moment fully while creating something that outlasted that moment. The topical references that made the plays immediate also make them difficult now, but the combination of intellectual ambition and theatrical inventiveness keeps them vital. His plays were performed in a theatre that held 15,000 people. The Theatre of Dionysus, carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis, wasn't just large, it was acoustically brilliant. An actor speaking at normal volume could be heard in the back rows. This matters because Aristophanes wrote for that specific space, that specific audience, that specific moment. The plays weren't literary exercises meant for quiet reading. They were public events, religious festivals, civic occasions where the entire community gathered to watch, laugh, and be challenged. The festival context shaped everything. The city Dionysia in spring and the Lennia in winter were dedicated to Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, and transformation. These weren't secular entertainment events, they were acts of worship, though worship that included mockery, obscenity, and political attacks that would seem blasphemous in most religious contexts. But Dionysian religion celebrated transgression, the breaking of normal boundaries, the temporary suspension of everyday rules. Comedy was sacred precisely because it violated sacred norms. 3 playwrights competed each festival, each presenting one comedy. The audience voted, though the actual selection of winners involved a complex system meant to prevent bribery. Aristophanes won first prize multiple times, but also placed second and third. The competition was fierce, and success wasn't guaranteed even for established playwrights. Each play was performed once, then essentially disappeared. No repeat performances, no touring productions. You wrote for that single day when the whole city would gather to judge your work. The financial arrangements were unusual by modern standards. The playwright didn't pay for production. Instead, the city assigned a chorgos, a wealthy citizen who funded the entire enterprise as a public service called a liturgy. This could cost enormous amounts. Costumes, masks, training the chorus, hiring musicians, feeding everyone during rehearsals. The chorgos gained prestige if his play won, but there was no financial return. It was competitive philanthropy, wealthy men demonstrating civic virtue through theatrical patronage. Aristophanes directed his own plays, trained the actors, probably composed the music, and sometimes performed. The role of playwright was much more hands-on than modern theatrical practice suggests. He wasn't writing scripts for others to interpret. He was creating total theatrical experiences, controlling every element from text to staging to performance. This integration of writing and directing meant the plays were conceived theatrically from the beginning, not as literary works later adapted for stage. The chorus was central to old comedy in ways modern readers often miss. 24 men, trained for weeks, singing and dancing in elaborate costumes. They represented wasps, birds, clouds, frogs, whatever the play required. The physical and vocal demands were extreme. The chorus didn't just comment on action. They were action, moving in precise formations, performing complex choreography, singing lyrics that ranged from beautiful to obscene. When you read an Aristophanic play, you're missing roughly half the experience because the choral performance is largely lost. The parabasis, where the chorus stepped forward and addressed the audience directly, represented a remarkable breaking of theatrical illusion. Imagine watching a play, then having the performers stop, turn to you, and start talking about the playwright's grievances, political opinions, or personal feuds. This wasn't subtle. The parabasis often explicitly said, "Aristophanes wants you to know," before launching into complaints about rival playwrights, judges who voted poorly, or politicians who deserved mockery. The audience accepted this convention, expected it even, as part of comedy's license to say anything. The costumes were grotesque and spectacular. Male characters wore large leather phalluses, which could be manipulated for comic effect. Characters could be beaten with them. Characters could use them as props. Characters could make visual jokes that survive only in vague textual references. Old women were played by men in exaggerated female costumes with enormous fake breasts and buttocks. The visual comedy was crude, physical, impossible to fully recover from the text alone. Aristophanes wrote for bodies in ridiculous costumes, performing outrageous actions, not for readers' passing meaning. Masks covered the actors' faces completely, with exaggerated features visible even from distant seats. This meant acting happened through voice and body, not facial expression. The masks also allowed rapid character changes. An actor could play multiple roles by switching masks. The convention created distance between performer and character, making it easier to satirize real people without the attack feeling personal. When Aristophanes mocked Socrates, an actor in a Socrates mask performed the role, creating a caricature rather than impersonation. The actual performance day was marathon. 3 tragedies and a satire play preceded the comedies. The audience had been sitting for hours before comedy even started. This affected how Aristophanes wrote. The opening needed to grab attention immediately, waking people up after serious tragic performances. The energy had to be high, the jokes had to land quickly, the absurd premise had to be established before attention wandered. Starting with a man on a dung beetle or a woman organising a sex strike wasn't random. It was calculated to shock a tired audience into engagement. Religious elements appeared throughout, but not in ways we'd recognise as reverent. Gods appeared as characters and were mocked mercilessly. Dionysus in frogs is cowardly and buffoonish. Hermes in peace is corrupt and self-interested. The plays didn't question the gods' existence. Atheism would have been genuinely shocking, but they questioned the gods' dignity, competence, and moral authority. This was acceptable because Dionysian festivals celebrated the breakdown of normal hierarchies. For one day, nothing was sacred, even the sacred. The political freedom was extraordinary. Cleon, the most powerful man in Athens, was portrayed as a corrupt, lying demagogue who manipulated the people through flattery and fear-mongering. Aristophanes had him played by a sausage seller, the lowest commercial occupation, who defeats him through even more shameless pandering. The play won first prize. Cleon couldn't stop it, couldn't prevent its performance, couldn't punish the playwright beyond one unsuccessful prosecution. This tells us something crucial about Athenian democracy. Its commitment to free speech was genuine, even when that speech attacked powerful leaders. But there were limits. You couldn't mock the democracy itself as illegitimate. You couldn't question the fundamental premise that citizens should rule. You could attack individual politicians, policies, wars, but not the system. Aristophanes was conservative in preferring aristocratic values and traditional education, but he never suggested overthrowing democracy. His satire worked within the system, using democratic freedoms to critique democratic practices. The audience wasn't passive. They shouted, laughed, heckled. A joke that failed was met with silence or worse. The playwright got immediate feedback about what worked and what didn't. This affected writing. You learned what your audience would accept, what lines landed, what references they understood. The plays surviving are the successful ones, the ones that pleased these demanding crowds. We can't fully know what failed plays looked like because they weren't preserved. Women attending the theatre is debated among scholars. Some evidence suggests they were present, other evidence suggests not. If they attended, they sat separately from men. But women were the subjects of several plays. Lysistrata, Thesmophoria Zeussae, Ecclesia Zeussae, which raises questions about audience. Were Aristophanes writing for or about an absent group? Or were women present, watching male actors in female masks portray them, laughing at representations of themselves? The answer changes how we read the play's sexual politics. The theatrical convention that all roles were played by men meant gender was always performance, never natural. A male actor played Lysistrata, who then gave a speech about women's intelligence and capability. The audience watched a man pretending to be a woman, pretending to have authority. This layering of performance made gender visible as construction rather than essence. Whether Aristophanes intended this as progressive commentary or simply accepted theatrical convention, the effect was to denaturalize gender roles. The obscenity was constant and inventive. References to excrement, genitalia, sexual acts, these weren't occasional jokes but sustained elements. Characters discussed sex explicitly, described body parts in detail, made puns on words that sounded like genitals. Modern translations often soften this or make it euphemistic, but the Greek was direct, crude, physiological. The audience expected this. Comedy's license included breaking taboos around bodily functions and sexual behaviour that would be unacceptable in other contexts, but the obscenity coexisted with beautiful poetry. The choral odes in Birds describing the creation of the cosmos are genuinely lyrical, with complex meters and striking imagery. Frogs contains literary criticism sophisticated enough that scholars still debate its implications. The range within a single play could be enormous, from a dog trial parody to philosophical arguments about tragedy's purpose, from characters defecating on stage to choruses singing about peace with genuine emotional power. This combination of high and low, crude and refined, political and personal, serious and absurd, this is what makes Aristophanes difficult to categorize. The plays aren't simply funny, or simply political, or simply literary. They're all these things simultaneously, refusing to separate them. The obscene jokes serve political purposes. The beautiful poetry appears in ridiculous contexts. The literary parodies make philosophical points. Nothing is pure or single purpose. The language itself was mixed. Aristophanes used various Greek dialects for comic effect. Spartans spoke Doric Greek, creating a linguistic marker of otherness. He parodied tragic language, philosophical jargon, legal terminology, each register clearly marked and available for mockery. The verbal texture was dense with allusion, reference, parody, wordplay. A single line might contain puns on political figures' names, references to recent events, and parodies of tragic verses, all compressed into a few words. This creates massive problems for translation and modern performance. The topical jokes require footnotes explaining who Cleonymus was and why calling him a coward was funny. The puns don't translate because they depend on Greek sounds and meanings. The tragic parodies lose force when audiences don't know the original tragedies being mocked. Modern performances often cut extensively, focusing on plot and broad comedy while losing the verbal density that made the plays sophisticated. The political specificity that made the plays immediate also made them dated. Within decades, audiences needed explanation of references. By Roman times, extensive commentary was necessary to understand allusions. The plays survived partly because they were selected for education. Students learned Greek by reading Aristophanes, which required teachers to explain historical context. This educational use preserved the texts, but also transformed them from living theatre to literary monuments, requiring scholarly apparatus. Yet something in the plays transcends their moment. The anti-war sentiment in Lysistrata speaks to every war, not just the Peloponnesian. The critique of political manipulation in Knights applies to any democracy where demagogues flatter voters. The tension between traditional and progressive education in Clouds recurs in every generation. The fantastic escapism of Birds appeals whenever people feel trapped by corrupt systems. The plays were written for specific circumstances, but touched human constants that make them readable across millennia. The fragments of lost plays suggest that much of Aristophanes' work dealt with similar themes and used similar techniques. We're not missing radically different kinds of plays. We're missing more of what we have. This means the 11 surviving plays probably represent his range fairly. Though 30 lost plays obviously contained individual brilliance will never recover. The survival pattern itself is interesting. The plays preserved were those selected for education, meaning plays that teachers thought appropriate for students. This probably biased preservation toward the more literary and less topical works. His sons continued writing comedy, producing plays under their own names and possibly under Aristophanes' name after his death. This suggests a family business, theatrical knowledge, and contacts passed from father to sons. The younger generation worked in the transitional period when old comedy was evolving into middle comedy, when the chorus was diminishing and plots were becoming less fantastic and political. Whether this evolution represented decline or adaptation depends on perspective. Aristophanes lived into his 60s or 70s, dying sometime after 386 BCE. We have almost no information about his death or final years. He disappears from the historical record, known only through his plays. The man becomes invisible behind the work, which is perhaps appropriate for someone who spent his career creating theatrical illusions, speaking through masks and choruses rather than in his own voice. What remains is the laughter, the anger, the beauty, the obscenity, the politics, all mixed into theatrical experiences that changed what comedy could do and what theatre could be. The influence rippled outward in directions nobody anticipated. Byzantine scholars preserved his texts, not because they loved crude comedy, but because Aristophanes taught classical Greek better than grammar books. Medieval monks copied manuscripts they probably found shocking, maintaining a tradition that kept the plays alive through centuries when theatre itself had vanished from Christian Europe. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought Aristophanes back into circulation, though sanitized translations often removed what made the plays actually funny. Erasmus admired the wit, scholars passed the grammar, but few actually staged the works because the political specificity seemed hopelessly dated and the sexual content remained unprintable. The French Revolution changed everything. Suddenly old comedies, attacks on demagogues and corrupt politicians felt immediately relevant. Revolutionary Paris saw Aristophanes as a democrat satirizing tyranny, conveniently ignoring his aristocratic prejudices and conservative values. The plays became ammunition in contemporary political battles, quoted selectively to support positions Aristophanes would have found absurd. This pattern of appropriation continued. Every political movement found what it needed in the texts. Socialists saw class conflict. Feminists discovered proto-feminism in Lysistrata's female empowerment. Anti-war activists claimed him as a pacifist, despite his plays celebrating Athenian military victories when they suited his purposes. The ideological flexibility came from the play's refusal to be systematic. Aristophanes attacked everything without offering coherent alternatives. He satirized democracy but also oligarchy. He mocked traditional religion but ridiculed atheistic philosophy. He championed peace but depicted peaceniks as cowards when convenient. The contradictions weren't flaws but features, comedy's privilege to criticize without constructing. Modern performance discovered new dimensions. The first complete English production of Lysistrata in 1910 caused scandalized reviews and packed houses. Audiences hadn't realized ancient Greeks were this raunchy. The combination of highbrow classical legitimacy and lowbrow sexual humor created unique appeal. You could claim educational value while enjoying dirty jokes, classical culture justifying guilty pleasures. Directors experimented wildly. Some staged Aristophanes as political allegory, updating references to contemporary targets. Others emphasized the fantasy elements, creating surreal spectacles. Still others played the text straight, attempting archaeological accuracy in costume and staging. Each approach revealed different aspects. The political productions showed the play's satirical edge still cut. The fantastical stagings highlighted the theatrical imagination. The archaeological attempts demonstrated how alien 5th century Athens actually was, how much context had been lost. Women's roles presented particular challenges and opportunities. Originally performed by men, often with exaggerated sexuality, the female characters gained complexity when actual women played them. Lysistrata transformed from a male fantasy of feminine wiles into something closer to genuine female agency. Praxagora's communist scheme in Ecclesia Zeusai could be read as empowering rather than merely absurd. The plays written to mock women's participation in politics accidentally created roles showcasing female intelligence and capability. Modern actresses found material richer than the playwright probably intended, exploiting tensions between the text's surface misogyny and its dramatic requirements for clever, effective female characters. Academic study intensified throughout the 20th century, generating enormous scholarly apparatus. Commentaries explained every obscure reference, identified every pun, contextualized every political allusion. This scholarship was essential for understanding, but also created distance. The plays became objects of study rather than living theatre. Students learned grammar from Aristophanes without experiencing the shock his contemporaries felt. The jokes required footnotes. The political barbs needed historical explanation. What had been immediate became mediated, filtered through centuries of interpretation. Yet something survived the transformation. The energy that made Athenian audiences laugh still connected across millennia. The anti-war sentiment in Lysistrata spoke to Vietnam, to Iraq, to every conflict where those not fighting made the decisions. The political manipulation in Knights described modern media democracy as clearly as ancient assemblies. The generational conflict in Clouds replayed whenever new technologies or ideas challenged traditional values. The escapist fantasy of birds offered relief from contemporary corruption, just as it had from Athenian imperialism. These weren't timeless truths exactly, but recurring patterns of human behaviour and social organisation that made the plays perpetually relevant. The adaptation industry proved insatiable. Lysistrata became a template applied to every conflict. Spike Lee's Chirac transposed it to gang violence in Chicago. A 2003 production set it during the Iraq War. Countless smaller adaptations addressed local conflicts worldwide. The basic premise, sex strike for peace, proved endlessly flexible, working for any situation where women had sexual leverage but no political power. Some adaptations were crude transplants, simply replacing ancient Athens with modern settings. Others engaged more creatively, finding equivalences rather than direct translations, discovering what the plays meant rather than what they said. Birds inspired utopian fantasies and dystopian warnings in equal measure. Science fiction writers borrowed the premise of escaping corrupt civilization to build something new. Political theorists referenced Cloud Cuckooland when discussing impossible schemes. The play's ambiguity about whether Pisataris was hero or villain, whether the new city was improvement or different tyranny, made it useful for multiple purposes. Optimists saw successful revolution. Pessimists saw proof that power corrupts regardless of intentions. Both readings existed in the text simultaneously, available depending on what readers brought to it. Frogs became a model for literary criticism as drama. Tom Stoppard's The Invention of Love stages similar debates about poetry's purpose. Academic conferences used the Aeschylus-Euripides contest as template for critical disagreements, scholars unconsciously reenacting arguments from 405 BCE about tradition versus innovation, moral uplift versus psychological realism. The play demonstrated that these debates were ancient, not modern inventions, that every generation fought over art's proper function and standards. The question of whether Aristophanes was actually funny occupied surprising energy. Scholars noted that ancient jokes often fell flat for modern audiences. The puns didn't translate. The scatological humour seemed juvenile. The sexual content was either too crude or not crude enough depending on contemporary standards. Some concluded that comedy was hopelessly culture-bound, that we could analyse Aristophanes historically, but couldn't genuinely laugh at him anymore. Others argued that good productions could recover the humour, that skilled performance overcame the distance, that laughter was more universal than skeptics claimed. The truth probably lay between extremes. Some jokes still landed. Others required explanation that killed them. The plays could be funny but differently than they were for original audiences, producing laughter of recognition rather than surprise, appreciation rather than shock. Performance styles evolved dramatically. Early 20th century productions were stately, emphasizing the lyric poetry and moral themes while downplaying the obscenity. Mid-century directors embraced the bawdiness, but often in cartoonish ways that made it safe through exaggeration. Late 20th century postmodern approaches deconstructed the texts, highlighting contradictions and ironies. 21st century productions often updated aggressively, treating ancient Athens as equivalent to contemporary society, finding modern correlatives for every ancient reference. Each style revealed different aspects while obscuring others. Stately productions showed the beauty but lost the bite. Bawdy versions captured the energy but missed the sophistication. Postmodern deconstructions were intellectually interesting but theatrically inert. Updated versions made the politics immediate but sacrificed the specific historical context that made the satire meaningful. The chorus remained problematic. Ancient productions had 24 chorus members performing complex choreography and singing sophisticated music, now lost. Modern productions couldn't or wouldn't match this scale. Some reduced the chorus to a handful of actors, others eliminated it entirely, distributing choral lines to individual characters. Still others experimented with multimedia approaches, using projections or recorded music to suggest the choral presence. None of these solutions fully worked because the chorus was fundamental to old comedy's structure and meaning. Without it, the plays became something different, closer to modern comedy than ancient. With it, productions faced enormous expense and the challenge of making archaic theatrical conventions feel natural to contemporary audiences. Translation presented endless difficulties. Literal versions preserved meaning but lost the poetry. Poetic translations captured the beauty but sometimes distorted content. Attempts to find English equivalents for Greek puns usually failed because the languages don't correspond. Some translators aimed for historical accuracy, using formal language to remind readers these were ancient texts. Others pursued contemporary immediacy, using slang and colloquialisms to recreate the shock value. The best translations acknowledged impossibility, preserving what could be preserved while honestly admitting what was lost, providing notes explaining untranslatable elements without pretending annotation could substitute for understanding. Educational use continued but changed. Earlier generations taught Aristophanes as moral exemplar or literary model. Modern syllabi approached him as historical evidence about Athenian democracy, intellectual history, and theatrical practice. Students read Knights to understand demagogues, Clouds to learn about Socrates' reputation, Lysistrata to study gender dynamics. This instrumental approach valued the plays as sources rather than art, mining them for information about ancient society. The method was historically valid, but risked reducing living theatre to dead documents, treating dramatic poetry as mere evidence for conclusions reached elsewhere. The play's conservatism became increasingly difficult to ignore or excuse. Aristophanes repeatedly mocked women, foreigners, and the poor. His political views aligned with aristocratic interests against democratic reforms. His educational philosophy defended traditional privilege against meritocratic challenge. His religious attitudes combined conventional piety with mockery of genuine philosophical inquiry. Modern productions face choices: present these attitudes honestly, risking offense, sanitize them, distorting the historical record, or contextualize them, adding layers of ironic distance. Each approach had costs. Honesty could perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Sanitization falsified history. Ironic distance created superiority that made genuine engagement impossible. Yet the plays continued generating new interpretations. Feminist scholars found unexpected complexity in the female characters. Post-colonial critics examined the treatment of non-Greeks and what it revealed about Athenian imperialism. Performance theorists analysed the meta-theatrical elements, how Aristophanes constantly reminded audiences they were watching theatre. Queer theorists explored the sexual politics and gender fluidity. Each critical approach discovered dimensions previous readers had missed, demonstrating the text's richness and capacity to sustain multiple readings. The influence extended beyond direct adaptation into broader cultural impact. Political satirists from Jonathan Swift to Jon Stewart worked in traditions Aristophanes helped establish, using comedy to attack power and hypocrisy. The idea that comedy could be politically serious, that laughter was a weapon rather than mere entertainment, traced back to old comedy. Modern satire's combination of crude humour and sophisticated critique, its willingness to name names and attack individuals, its mixing of fantasy and realism, all had precedence in Aristophanes. Whether modern satirists knew him directly or absorbed his influence through intermediaries, They worked in traditions he helped create. The fragments tantalized with what was lost. A line here, a plot summary there, hints of plays that might have been as brilliant as those surviving. Scholars reconstructed lost works from fragments and ancient commentaries, building elaborate hypotheses on minimal evidence. Some lost plays apparently dealt with similar themes as survivors: war, politics, new versus old education. Others seem to have explored different territory entirely. We'll never know what unique insights vanished, what jokes died with ancient audiences, what satirical targets escaped modern knowledge because the plays attacking them disappeared. Aristophanes died sometime after 386 BCE, probably in his 60s or 70s. The exact date is unknown. The circumstances are unrecorded. He simply disappears from history, leaving only the plays behind. His sons continued the theatrical tradition, producing comedies under their own names and possibly under his, keeping the family business alive for another generation. But the Athens they worked in was different. The Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat. Democracy had been briefly overthrown and restored in weakened form. The imperial ambitions were dead. The intellectual ferment had cooled. The specific conditions that made old comedy possible, robust free speech, intense political engagement, wealthy sponsors willing to finance elaborate productions, were fading. Middle comedy emerged in this changed environment, different in tone and structure, less political, more domestic, smaller choruses or none at all, more focus on social types than specific individuals. The evolution represented adaptation to new circumstances, but also loss of something vital. Old comedy's particular combination of political fearlessness, theatrical extravagance, and literary sophistication wouldn't be seen again. Aristophanes lived long enough to participate in this transition, his late plays showing the shift toward new forms. Whether he embraced the change or resented it, we don't know. The surviving plays represent his achievement, preserved in amber, testimony to what one artist could accomplish in a specific moment when conditions aligned perfectly. Comedy requires freedom, wealth, peace, and democratic institutions willing to tolerate mockery. Remove any element and the form collapses. Aristophanes worked when all were present, even if precariously. His successors inherited a diminished world. The transmission of his works through antiquity followed patterns similar to other classical authors. Byzantine scholars selected 11 plays for educational purposes, creating the corpus that survived. Why these 11? Probably pedagogical utility combined with manuscript availability. Lysistrata and Clouds taught moral lessons about sexual propriety and dangerous philosophy. Frogs offered a literary criticism. Plutus explored economic questions. The selection wasn't purely literary merit. Lost plays might have been equally brilliant but less useful for Christian educators uncomfortable with pagan religion or political content. The accident of preservation shaped reception dramatically. Had different plays survived, our understanding of Aristophanes would shift fundamentally. Medieval manuscripts copied in scriptoria preserved these 11 through the Dark Ages, when most classical literature disappeared. Monks who copied pagan texts didn't necessarily approve of their content. Some added marginal notes, condemning immorality or correcting theology, but they copied faithfully, recognizing cultural value even when disapproving morally. The plays arrived in Renaissance Europe through Byzantine refugees fleeing Ottoman conquest, carrying manuscripts west. Humanist scholars encountered Aristophanes with excitement and confusion. Here was comedy from classical Athens, witty and sophisticated, but also crude beyond anything contemporary standards permitted. How to reconcile admiration for classical culture with discomfort about obscenity. Early printed editions often sanitized content, cutting sexual jokes or translating them into Latin to protect vernacular readers. Commentary explained historical context while apologizing for vulgarity. The plays were studied but rarely performed. Staging seemed impossible given content and form. The enormous choruses, the topical references, the political satire of long-dead figures all created barriers. Aristophanes became a closet dramatist, read privately rather than experienced theatrically. This diminished his achievement fundamentally, since the plays were written for performance, their effects calculated for specific theatrical conditions. 19th century classical scholarship approached Aristophanes with new seriousness. Philologists produced critical editions establishing reliable texts. Historians mined the plays for information about Athenian life, treating them as historical documents rather than literary works. The plays offered unparalleled insight into democratic politics, jury systems, military service, religious festivals, daily life. Details unavailable elsewhere appeared in Aristophanes: what people ate, wore, said, believed. His value as historical source sometimes overshadowed appreciation of artistic achievement. He became evidence rather than art. Performance history remained sparse until the 20th century. Occasional productions occurred, usually heavily adapted. Victorian performances cut obscenity and modernized references, creating genteel versions unrecognizable to ancient audiences. The energy, physicality, and transgressive quality disappeared. What remained was sanitized drawing room comedy. Aristophanes defanged. Only in recent decades have productions attempted recovering the original's rawness. Modern directors stage the plays with full sexual content, exaggerated physicality, and political bite. Audiences sometimes react with shock, which is appropriate. The plays were meant to shock. Translation presents particular challenges. Aristophanes' language operates on multiple registers simultaneously: elevated tragic parody, colloquial speech, obscene slang, lyric poetry. Puns and wordplay don't transfer across languages. Topical references require extensive notes. Some translators prioritize accuracy, producing literal versions incomprehensible without commentary. Others prioritize theatrical effectiveness, modernizing references and substituting contemporary equivalents for ancient targets. Neither approach fully succeeds. Accuracy produces unperformable texts. Modernization loses historical specificity. The best translations balance both impulses, remaining faithful while acknowledging theatrical necessity. The political content creates ongoing controversy. Productions must decide whether to update political references or maintain historical distance. Setting Lysistrata during Vietnam or Iraq makes the anti-war message immediate, but loses ancient context. Keeping the Peloponnesian War setting preserves accuracy but creates distance. Directors make different choices based on intended effects. Some productions use Aristophanes as commentary on current events, others as historical recreation. Both approaches have validity. The plays contain universal themes alongside specific circumstances. They speak to permanent human concerns: war, corruption, demagoguery, while addressing particular Athenian situations. Academic scholarship continues discovering new dimensions. Performance studies examines how the plays work theatrically, reconstructing staging, choreography, music. Gender studies explores the complex treatment of women and sexuality. Political theory analyzes democratic critique. Comparative literature places Aristophanes alongside later satirists. Each approach reveals aspects previous readers missed. The plays remain inexhaustible, generating new interpretations as critical methods evolve. This richness explains their survival. Works that yield one reading and no more get exhausted. Aristophanes sustains endless investigation. His influence on Western comedy extends far beyond direct imitation. The tradition of political satire using humour as weapon traces partly through him. Writers, attacking power through mockery, work in lineages he helped establish. Not all knew Aristophanes directly. Many absorbed his influence through intermediaries or reinvented similar techniques independently. But the idea that comedy could be serious, that laughter could criticize, that theatre could engage politics, these principles found early formulation in Old Comedy. Whether modern satirists acknowledge the debt or not, they work in traditions Aristophanes shaped. The plays also influenced dramatic theory. Aristotle's Poetics discusses tragedy extensively, but mentions comedy only briefly. What survives suggests he saw comedy as representing people worse than they are, tragedy as better. This formulation derives partly from Aristophanic practice. The exaggerated characters, the fantastic plots, the physical humour all create comic distance. Later theorists developed more sophisticated comedy analysis, but Aristophanes provided foundational examples. His work demonstrated that comedy could achieve artistic complexity, matching tragedy, while operating through different means. Modern adaptations continue appearing. Lysistrata gets updated for every conflict: Vietnam, Iraq, various regional wars. The core premise translates easily: women withholding sex to stop violence. Directors adjust details but maintain structure. Other plays receive similar treatment. The Birds becomes commentary on urban development or environmental destruction. Clouds satirizes contemporary education debates. Plutus addresses economic inequality. The play's frameworks prove durable, applicable to situations Aristophanes couldn't imagine. This adaptability explains ongoing vitality. Dead works resist reinterpretation. Living works generate new meanings. What would Aristophanes think seeing his plays performed 2,400 years later in languages he never heard? The question seems pointless but isn't. He wrote for immediate Athenian audiences, addressing specific political situations. The plays were timely interventions, not timeless literature. Their survival and continued performance would probably astonish him, but he'd likely appreciate that comedy still attacks power, still uses laughter as weapon, still gives voice to frustrations with leadership and war and pretension. The specifics change, the impulse remains constant. The 11 surviving plays represent fragments of a much larger output. 29 lost completely. We'll never know what unique insights vanished, what jokes died with ancient audiences. Some fragments suggest brilliance equal to survivors. A line here captures perfect comic timing. A plot summary there hints at sophisticated satire. But fragments can't recreate the whole. The lost plays remain ghosts, tantalizing possibilities never fully knowable. Yet what survives suffices to establish Aristophanes as comedy's first master, the earliest comic playwright, whose work survives substantially intact. He didn't invent comedy, the form existed before him, but he perfected it, demonstrating its range and power. Everything comedy could accomplish: political critique, literary parody, social satire, pure silliness, appears in these 11 plays. They show the form's full potential, possibilities later comedy would explore and develop, but never entirely transcend. The work outlived its creator by millennia. The man died probably in the 380s BCE, leaving sons to continue theatrical traditions. His plays survived through chance, selection, manuscript transmission, editorial choice. They arrived in modernity battered but intact, testimony to achievement so considerable that even incomplete preservation couldn't obscure brilliance. Scholars study them, directors stage them, audiences laugh at jokes written before Rome existed. The comedy transcends its origins, speaking across centuries to anyone who recognizes the absurdity in politics, the gap between ideals and reality, the human capacity for self-deception and occasional wisdom. Comedy reveals truths tragedy obscures. Tragedy elevates, finding nobility in suffering. comedy deflates, exposing pretension and folly. Both are necessary. Both tell truths about human nature. Aristophanes chose comedy, making audiences laugh while forcing recognition of uncomfortable realities. The laughter made the criticism bearable. The criticism gave the laughter purpose. Together, they created something neither could achieve alone: entertainment that enlightens, satire that survives. His Athens disappeared. The democracy fell. The empire collapsed. The specific politicians he mocked died and were forgotten, except through his attacks. The wars ended. The intellectual movements evolved. Everything that seemed permanent proved temporary. Only the plays remained, outlasting everything they documented. They became monuments to a vanished world, preserving in art what history lost in fact. Through them we glimpse Athenian democracy at its height: chaotic, vital, argumentative, creative, maddening, magnificent. We hear the voices that filled the assembly, see the plays that packed the theatre, taste the wine that fueled the symposia. The preservation wasn't inevitable. Countless ancient works vanished. Aristophanes survived partly through merit, partly through luck. Byzantine educators chose these plays. Monks copied them. Renaissance scholars printed them. Each generation found value sufficient to justify preservation. The transmission chain held across 2,400 years. One broken link and everything disappears. But it held, and we inherited 11 plays showing what comedy could achieve when conditions aligned, when democracy permitted freedom, when artists possessed genius, when culture valued both entertainment and truth. That's what remains after the facts are catalogued, the controversies debated, the interpretations argued. Comedy that still works, satire that still stings, art that survives its context while illuminating it, laughter that resonates across millennia. Aristophanes died in the 4th century BCE. His comedy lives still. The greatest comic playwright of ancient Athens left almost nothing behind but laughter captured in text. No statues commemorated him. No biographical tradition preserved his personal story. The man himself dissolved into history while his words persisted, copied and recopied through centuries of manuscript transmission, surviving plagues and wars and the collapse of civilizations. What we know about Aristophanes, the person could fit on a few pages. Born around 446 BCE to a moderately wealthy family, wrote approximately 40 plays, won multiple festival prizes, had sons who continued in theatre. Died sometime after 386 BCE. The rest is inference and speculation, reconstructed from fragments in his own works and later commentaries, written by people guessing as much as we are. But what we know about his achievement fills libraries. 11 complete plays demonstrating comedy's full range and power. Political satire that could end careers. Literary parody requiring encyclopedic knowledge. Social criticism wrapped in absurdist fantasy. Crude physical humour coexisting with lyric beauty. All performed before audiences of thousands in a theatre carved into the Acropolis slope. Presented as worship of Dionysus, god of transformation and transgression. The freedom he exercised remains almost incomprehensible. Imagine attacking the most powerful politician in your country by name, portraying him as corrupt and stupid, while your nation is at war, and having the work win first prize in a state-sponsored festival. That's what Aristophanes did repeatedly. Athens permitted this, protected it, celebrated it. The democracy's commitment to free speech was genuine enough to tolerate savage mockery of its leaders and institutions. Yet the freedom had boundaries. You couldn't question democracy's legitimacy, only its practice. You couldn't advocate oligarchy, only criticize demagogues. You couldn't undermine the war effort too explicitly, only mock the profiteers and question specific strategies. Aristophanes worked within these limits, pushing them constantly but never quite breaking them. His conservatism was real. He preferred traditional values, aristocratic culture, old-fashioned education, but he expressed it through democratic forms, using free speech to attack democratic excesses. The plays outlived their moment because they touched something beyond Athenian politics. The specific targets disappeared. Cleon dead, the Peloponnesian War ended, the intellectual movements evolved, but the patterns persisted. Every democracy has demagogues. Every war produces profiteers and exhaustion. Every generation argues about education and values. The frameworks Aristophanes created proved durable, applicable to situations he never imagined. Modern productions face impossible choices: update the references and lose historical specificity, maintain accuracy and create distance, emphasize the politics and sacrifice the fantasy, focus on the crude humor and miss the sophistication. Every director balances these tensions differently, creating vastly different experiences from identical texts. The plays contain enough complexity to sustain multiple interpretations, which is why they keep getting performed. Translation presents similar challenges. The puns don't transfer. The topical jokes require footnotes. The obscenity shocks differently now than then. Literal versions preserve meaning but lose poetry. Free adaptations capture energy but distort content. The best translations acknowledge impossibility, doing what can be done while honestly admitting what's lost. No English version fully captures the Greek original, but good ones approximate enough to work theatrically. Academic scholarship has generated enormous apparatus around these 11 plays. Commentaries explaining every reference, analysing every meter, contextualising every political allusion. This scholarship is invaluable for understanding, but creates distance from the immediate theatrical experience. The plays become objects of study rather than living performance. Students learn grammar from Aristophanes without experiencing the shock his audiences felt. Yet something survives all the mediation. The anti-war sentiment in Lysistrata still resonates. The political manipulation in Knights still describes contemporary democracy. The generational conflict in Cloud still plays out over new technologies and values. The escapist fantasy of birds still appeals when systems seem corrupt beyond reform. These aren't timeless truths exactly, but recurring patterns making the plays perpetually relevant. The conservative literary preferences are clear throughout. Aristophanes favoured Aeschylus over Euripides, old education over sophistry, traditional values over modern questioning, rural simplicity over urban sophistication. His politics aligned with aristocratic interests more than democratic reforms. His social views reflected the prejudices of his class and time. Modern readers rightly note these limitations while recognising the artistic achievement they frame. The missing plays haunt scholarship. 29 works lost completely, known only through fragments and ancient plot summaries. Some apparently match the survivors in brilliance. Others may have explored different territory entirely. We'll never know what unique insights vanished, what satirical targets escaped modern knowledge because the plays attacking them disappeared. The accident of preservation shaped our understanding fundamentally. What would he think seeing his plays performed 24 centuries later in languages he never heard, in theatres he couldn't imagine, for audiences who need footnotes explaining his jokes? The question seems pointless, but isn't. He wrote for immediate political intervention, addressing specific Athenian situations. The survival would probably astonish him, but he might appreciate that comedy still attacks power, still uses laughter as weapon, still matters politically. The influence extends beyond direct adaptation into broader cultural impact. Political satirists from Swift to Stewart work in traditions Aristophanes helped establish. The idea that comedy could be serious, that laughter could criticise, that theatre could engage politics, these principles found early formulation in old comedy. Modern satirists may not know him directly, but they work in lineages he shaped. His Athens disappeared, the democracy fell, the empire collapsed. The specific politicians he mocked died and were forgotten except through his attacks. The wars ended, the intellectual movements evolved, everything that seemed permanent proved temporary. Only the plays remained, outlasting everything they documented, becoming monuments to a vanished world. The preservation wasn't inevitable. Countless ancient works disappeared. Aristophanes survived through merit and luck combined. Byzantine educators selected these plays, monks copied them, Renaissance scholars printed them. Each generation found value sufficient to justify preservation. The transmission chain held across 2,400 years, and we inherited 11 plays showing what comedy could achieve when conditions aligned. That's the legacy. Not biographical details or personal philosophy, but achievement preserved in art, comedy that still works, satire that still stings, laughter that resonates across millennia. The man died in the 4th century BCE. His comedy lives still, performed and adapted and studied and argued over. Testimony to what one artist accomplished in a specific moment when democracy permitted freedom, when culture valued both entertainment and truth, when genius met opportunity. The plays ask us to laugh at power, question authority, recognize absurdity in politics and ourselves. They demonstrate that comedy isn't trivial, that laughter can be serious, that mockery serves democracy by preventing any person or institution from becoming sacred. These lessons remain urgent. Every generation needs reminding that leaders deserve scrutiny, that war demands questioning, that new ideas shouldn't be dismissed merely for being new, that old values shouldn't be abandoned merely for being old. Aristophanes provided no systematic philosophy, no coherent political program, no clear answers. He attacked everything without offering alternatives, which is comedy's privilege and limitation. The plays criticize without constructing, mock without proposing, question without resolving. This can feel unsatisfying to readers seeking solutions, but perhaps recognizing problems clearly is enough. Perhaps making audiences laugh while forcing them to think is sufficient contribution. The greatest comic playwright of ancient Athens left 11 plays showing comedy's full potential. They survive as fragments of a much larger output, testimony to achievements so considerable that even incomplete preservation couldn't obscure brilliance. Scholars study them, directors stage them, audiences laugh at jokes written before Rome existed. The comedy transcends its origins, speaking to anyone who recognizes the gap between ideals and reality, the absurdity in politics, the human capacity for self-deception and occasional wisdom. Comedy reveals, truth's tragedy obscures, tragedy elevates, finding nobility in suffering. Comedy deflates, exposing pretension and folly. Both are necessary. Aristophanes chose comedy, making audiences laugh while forcing recognition of uncomfortable realities. The laughter made the criticism bearable. The criticism gave the laughter purpose. Together, they created something neither could achieve alone. The work outlived its creator by millennia. It arrived in modernity battered but intact, preserved through chance and choice across centuries of transmission. What remains after all the scholarship and debate is simply this: comedy that still works, satire that still matters, art that illuminates while entertaining. Aristophanes died more than 2,000 years ago, but stand in any theatre where his plays are performed and you'll hear what he heard. Laughter, recognition, the shock of truth delivered through absurdity. That sound bridges millennia. That's what survives when everything else disappears. That's the achievement no amount of lost plays or missing biographical details can diminish.